The moment I saw the envelope sitting on my kitchen table, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just paper, it was betrayal, folded neatly and waiting for me to open it. Inside, I found legal documents with my own shaky signature at the bottom, transferring my late husband's house to my son and his wife. My house. The place Frank and I had poured 40 years of sweat, arguments, laughter, and love into. The place I thought I'd live out the rest of my days. I remember the air going thin, like the walls themselves were closing in. I could almost hear Frank's voice in the silence, steady and protective, as if warning me not to trust too easily. That signature, they said it was mine, but I knew I had never agreed to give away the only home I had left. Somehow, they had tricked me, my own family. I'm 70 years old, widowed for almost a decade, retired after a lifetime of teaching kids who often respected me more than my own children do now. I thought being generous, being understanding, would make me easier to love. Instead, it made me easy to take from. And standing there in my kitchen, I realized they believed I was too old, too soft, too dependent to fight back. The betrayal stung sharper than the loss itself. It wasn't just about a house. It was about trust, dignity, the quiet assumption that I didn't matter anymore. And deep inside, something cracked open. This wasn't the first time they had dismissed me, taken advantage of me, or decided what was best without asking. No, this was only the latest wound in a long pattern of small cuts. And that's when I knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was the culmination of years of being underestimated. And it was time I started paying attention to just how deep those roots of betrayal really went. I sometimes look back on my life and wonder how I became so invisible in my own family. It didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly, the way water seeps through cracks until the foundation starts to weaken. For years, I told myself it was just part of aging, part of stepping aside for the younger generation. But the truth is, I gave so much of myself that they stopped seeing me as a person at all. When my husband passed away, I poured everything I had into keeping our family together. I kept Sunday dinners alive, even when everyone came late and left early. I cooked meals from scratch roasts that filled the whole house with the smell of garlic and rosemary, pies that reminded me of holidays gone by. But those dinners changed over time. The laughter wasn't about shared memories anymore. It became conversations about stock portfolios, promotions, and vacations I was never invited on. I'd sit at the edge of the table, nodding politely, my words slipping into silence as theirs filled the room. I can still see the way my daughter-in-law looked at the pie I baked last Christmas. The crust was golden, flaking just the way Frank used to love. But she placed it down at the far end of the table, making room for the glossy cake she ordered from some expensive bakery. People reached for the cake, their forks clinking against the porcelain plates, while my pie sat untouched. I told myself it didn't matter that baking was just my way of showing love, but in that moment, it felt like more than dessert was being dismissed. It wasn't just dinners. There were smaller moments, sharper in their own way. The time my son told me it would be practical to add his wife to my credit card, just in case of emergencies for the grandson. I wanted to believe it was out of concern, out of trust. But soon, I saw spa charges, designer dinners, little luxuries that weren't for Tyler at all. I swallowed my unease because I didn't want to seem ungrateful or mistrustful. I told myself it was just money, and family mattered more than keeping accounts perfectly balanced. There were comments too, little barbs wrapped in laughter. My daughter-in-law once joked in front of guests that I was sweet, but useless at social gatherings. Everyone laughed lightly, unsure if it was harmless fun or cruelty dressed as humor. I smiled because I didn't want to cause a scene. But inside, I felt the sting of being reduced to a burden, a decorative presence instead of someone with value. Even my son didn't defend me, he just tightened his jaw and looked away. That silence hurt more than the words. I tried to brush it off, to remind myself of the years I'd spent raising him on my own, the nights I stayed up late sewing his Halloween costumes, the mornings I packed his lunches, the endless hours of encouragement and discipline that helped him become the man he is. I wanted to believe all of that still meant something, but in those quiet moments, driving home alone after another dinner where my stories went unheard, I wondered if the years of sacrifice had faded in their memory, leaving me as nothing more than an old woman clinging to tradition. I think what cut deepest was the growing sense that they weren't just overlooking me, they were preparing me to disappear, suggesting retirement homes under the guise of safety, offering to handle my bills because it would be easier, gently reminding me of my age as if I'd forgotten. Each word was framed as concern, but it carried the weight of dismissal, as if I couldn't be trusted with my own life anymore. I've always been a woman of quiet endurance. As a teacher, I learned to steady my voice even when classrooms were noisy, to stand tall even when I was exhausted. That same strength carried me into motherhood, through grief, through widowhood. But there comes a point when endurance starts to feel like erasure, when staying silent becomes permission for others to take more. And deep down, I sensed something larger was brewing. These little humiliations, these subtle dismissals, they weren't isolated. They were pieces of a bigger pattern, hints of a betrayal I hadn't yet fully seen. I could feel it like a storm building at the edge of the horizon, waiting to break. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my instincts whispered otherwise. And soon enough, I would discover just how right those instincts were. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day when I usually lingered over my coffee and crossword puzzle. But that morning, my daughter-in-law had left a folder sitting carelessly on the hall table when she stopped by. She must have thought I wouldn't notice it, or worse. She assumed I was too blind or too simple to bother looking. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the memory of a dozen small humiliations pressing down all at once. Inside, I found neatly organized documents with my name scrawled across them. Page after page of signatures that looked like mine, but weren't. At first, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My hands trembled as I traced the lines of ink that seemed to betray me. The papers were legal transfers of my home, of my small savings account, even of the insurance policy I had faithfully kept since Frank died. Everything that gave me security, everything I had worked for, had been quietly shifted into my son and his wife's names. According to these papers, I had agreed to hand over my life. The rage came in waves, but it wasn't loud or wild. It was the cold, quiet kind of fury that settles into your bones. I thought of the nights I had worked extra tutoring sessions to cover his college tuition, the years I had skipped vacations so there would be enough for braces, music lessons, and camp fees. And here I was, a footnote in my own story, erased with a forged pen stroke. Part of me wanted to march straight to their house, slam the papers down on the table, and demand an explanation. But another part of me, older, wiser, knew that storming in would only get me more carefully cornered. If they were bold enough to do this, then they were confident I wouldn't fight back. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my silence for surrender. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the documents, listening to the old clock ticking above the sink. Every tick felt like a reminder that my life had been slowly stolen while I was too busy trying to keep peace in the family. They thought age had dulled me. But in that moment, I felt sharper than I had in years. I folded the papers neatly and slipped them back into the folder exactly as I had found them. No calls, no confrontations, no accusations. Not yet. Instead, I made myself a second cup of coffee and let the anger settle into something steadier resolve. If they wanted me to be the foolish old woman who couldn't keep track of her own affairs, then I would let them believe it. I would play along. I would smile at dinners, nod through their patronizing advice, pretend not to notice when they spoke of me in the past tense as if I was already gone. But behind the smile, I would be watching, listening, taking note. Because now I knew the truth. Their betrayals weren't thoughtless oversights or careless slights. They were calculated, planned, and I wasn't about to let them walk me out of my own life. That morning marked a shift I can never forget. I stopped being the woman who hoped for scraps of kindness, and I became the woman who waited, quietly, for her chance to strike back. And that chance was coming sooner than they ever expected. From the outside, I must have looked like the perfect picture of surrender. I smiled when my daughter-in-law reminded me that she would handle the paperwork from now on. I nodded when my son spoke slowly, as if age had dulled my ability to understand. I even pretended to fumble with my glasses when they slid another stack of forms across the table. To them, I was predictable, compliant, an old woman too tired to question anything. But inside, every nerve was sharp, every sense alive. I had already seen what they were capable of, and I wasn't about to let them know I was onto them. So, I played the role they wanted while quietly collecting the truth. I began carrying a small notebook tucked inside my purse, pretending it was for grocery lists. In reality, I wrote down every odd transaction they mentioned, every phrase that hinted at their plans. When I sat in their kitchen and they excused themselves to the living room, I leaned closer to the paperwork spread out on the counter. I memorized dates, account numbers, even scribbled a few details down when they weren't looking. My daughter-in-law was so confident in her act that she never noticed. The more I watched, the bolder they became. They spoke of liquidating assets and finalizing transfers as though I wasn't even in the room. Their arrogance grew with each passing day, and the more they underestimated me, the more determined I became. It was during one of those dinners when I felt most like a ghost in my own family that I found my unexpected ally. Across the table, my son's old college friend, Mark, had been invited. Mark had once been my student in high school, back when I taught literature. I saw the flicker in his eyes as he watched me sit silently while Vanessa spoke over me. After dinner, as coats were being collected, he lingered behind and quietly asked if I was all right. There was something about his voice, genuine concern, not pity, that made me pause. Later that week, I stopped by his office. I hadn't realized he had gone on to become a lawyer. Sitting across from him, I laid out the documents I had seen, the signatures that weren't mine, the transfers that threatened to strip me of everything. His face hardened, not with shock, but with recognition. He told me he had seen this kind of scheme before, elder exploitation wrapped in the language of family care. For the first time in months, I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. What I suspected was real. And now, I had someone who believed me. Mark didn't just listen. He began helping me piece together what I would need to protect myself. He explained what to look for, what to copy, how to leave a trail of evidence that would hold up if I needed it. I left his office with a new kind of confidence. I wasn't just pretending anymore, I had a plan. And with every fake smile and polite nod I gave at the dinner table, I was moving closer to exposing them. Still, the danger was real. I could feel it in the way Vanessa studied me sometimes, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if she was trying to decide whether I was as oblivious as I pretended to be. My heart would race in those moments, but I never let it show. I stirred my coffee, asked about her new furniture, complimented her dress, anything to keep her convinced I was harmless. But behind my calm exterior, I was ready. I was tired of being erased, tired of watching my life signed away in silence. With Mark's help, I now had proof, and with every passing day, the confrontation drew closer. I wasn't just waiting anymore. I was preparing, and soon, they would learn that the quiet woman they thought they had outsmarted was far from finished. The night of the confrontation, I felt an odd calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you've carried fear for so long that it finally burns itself out. My son and his wife had invited me to meet them at a local cafe to finalize arrangements. They thought it was going to be another quiet signing, another moment where I played the role of the frail mother who didn't know any better. But this time, I walked in prepared. The cafe was crowded enough to feel safe, yet intimate enough that every detail carried weight. I slid into the booth across from them, my purse heavy with the evidence I had collected. They smiled politely, the kind of smiles that never touched their eyes. On the table in front of them was another neat stack of papers, ready for my signature. I let them explain their plan in the same condescending tone they always used. My son leaned in, speaking carefully as if I were a child, while Vanessa chimed in with her sugary assurances. I nodded, played along, even asked small questions that made them believe I was hesitant but still willing. Every moment was part of the act, each second buying me time. Then, as Vanessa slid the final page toward me, I opened my purse. Instead of reaching for a pen, I laid down a folder of my own. Inside were copies of the forged documents, photos of account transfers, and a detailed timeline of every suspicious move they had made collected with Mark's guidance. For the first time in months, the silence belonged to me. Their faces drained of color, and I could almost hear the rush of blood in their ears. Vanessa's polished smile faltered, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic beneath. My son stared at the papers like they might burst into flames. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke steadily, telling them that I knew everything, that the signatures were false, that the accounts had been drained, that their little scheme was no longer a secret. I explained that copies of the evidence were already in the hands of a lawyer, and that any attempt to pressure me further would only make their situation worse. It was not the kind of dramatic shouting match you see in movies. It was quieter, sharper, and far more devastating. Because in that moment, they realized the game was over. They had built their confidence on the belief that I was weak. And now, confronted with the truth, they had nothing left to stand on. I watched them squirm, searching for excuses, for loopholes, for some way to regain control. But I didn't give them the chance. I reminded them of every sacrifice I had made, every kindness they had twisted into opportunity. And then I told them, calmly and without hesitation, that it was finished. The cafe noise buzzed around us, cups clinking, conversations rising and falling, but at that table, it felt like the world had gone still. For once, they had to look at me, not as a helpless old woman, but as someone who had stood up and taken her power back. When I gathered my papers and slid out of the booth, I left them sitting there in stunned silence. I didn't need to see what came next. The evidence was strong. My ally was prepared, and their arrogance had written their own ending. Walking out into the cool night air, I felt taller than I had in years. The weight I had carried, the fear, the humiliation, the quiet ache of betrayal lifted from my shoulders. I had faced them, and I had won. But more than that, I had found something even more valuable, the reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And yet, even as the relief washed over me, I knew this was not the end. There were still wounds to process, lessons to hold close. The confrontation was over, but the reflection, the part that would shape the rest of my life, was just beginning. When I walked out of that cafe, I wasn't just leaving behind the people who had betrayed me. I was leaving behind years of silence, years of shrinking myself so others could feel bigger. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady in my own skin. The house, the money, the papers, they mattered. Yes. But what mattered more was that I had reclaimed my dignity. I thought about all the moments when I had let small humiliations slide, the ignored desserts at family dinners, the careless jokes at my expense, the quiet way my son looked away instead of standing up for me. I used to tell myself it was better to endure than to make waves, but now I see that endurance without boundaries only teaches others that your kindness is theirs to exploit. Standing up for myself wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, it was deliberate, and it reminded me of who I really am, a woman who has raised a child, weathered widowhood, and spent decades guiding young people through classrooms filled with chaos. I've been underestimated before, but I've never been broken. This experience taught me something I wish I had realized sooner. Being overlooked doesn't make you powerless. Sometimes it's exactly what gives you the chance to see clearly, to plan carefully, and to rise when no one expects you to. What they thought was weakness turned out to be my greatest strength. I know there are others out there who have felt the sting of being dismissed parents who gave everything only to feel invisible. Grandparents who are spoken over as if their voices don't matter. Partners who find themselves quietly erased from decisions that shape their lives. To anyone listening who knows that feeling, you are not powerless. Your story, your dignity, your worth, it cannot be signed away on a piece of paper. If anything, this chapter of my life has reminded me that it is never too late to draw a line, to demand respect, to take back control. And maybe that's the gift of betrayal. It forces you to finally see your own strength. As I close this chapter, I carry not just relief, but pride. Pride that I refuse to let myself be erased. Pride that I chose to fight, not with rage, but with resolve. And pride that I found my voice again, even if it took me longer than I'd hoped. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or taken for granted, I'd love to hear your experience. Share it in the comments, because your voice matters too. And if you believe in stories that remind us of resilience and self-worth, please like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and subscribe for more. Because none of us are truly invisible, not when we choose to stand up and be seen.